The Kash Patel and Adam Schiff confrontation was never going to be a mild oversight disagreement. There was too much history, too much suspicion, and too much symbolic meaning packed into both men for that. By the time the two of them collided in 2025, the fight had already been waiting for years. Schiff had become one of the most recognizable Democratic figures associated with warning the country about Trump, defending institutional investigation, and treating the erosion of law enforcement independence as an urgent Democratic threat. Patel had become one of the most recognizable Trump world figures associated with treating those same investigations as proof of deep state abuse, elite corruption, and political warfare against Trump. That is why this pair matters, because when Adam Schiff pressed Kash Patel, he was not only cross-examining an FBI director, he was confronting one of the most vivid embodiments of the anti-institutional rights answer to his entire political worldview. And when Patel fired back, he was not only insulting a senator, he was attacking one of the most visible human symbols of the investigative order that Trump's movement believes tried to destroy its leader and then cover its own motives under the language of law. That is the real story. It is not simply a hearing clash. It is a confrontation between rival explanations of the state. Patel's side says the FBI and the broader federal investigative apparatus were politicized against Trump, and the old custodians of that system still do not want to admit it. Schiff's side says the real danger is not that the FBI once had too much independence from Trump, but that under people like Patel, it is being turned into an instrument of loyalty, retaliation, and narrative revision. That is why every exchange between them carries more weight than the immediate question on the page. This becomes especially clear in two pieces of recent public evidence. First, Reuters' 2025 special report on Trump's campaign of retribution made clear that Patel had long publicly named an enemies list of officials and critics he believed were part of the deep state, even as he later denied during his confirmation hearing that it functioned as such. Reuters found that many people on the list had since faced some form of retaliation or official consequence under the broader Trump-era climate. Schiff was one of the names associated with that world of targets. This matters because it means that when Schiff questions Patel's politicization, he is not doing so from theory alone. He is doing so as someone who belongs to the very category of people Patel's politics has taught supporters to distrust, punish, and portray as frauds. Second, in September 2025, a fiery Senate Judiciary hearing on FBI oversight featured a direct clash between the two men. AP reported that Patel repeatedly clashed with Democratic senators, including Schiff, who accused him of politicizing the Bureau and engaging in retribution against Trump's adversaries. That hearing became one of the clearest public theaters for their hostility. Those two backbones together tell you why the pair is so strong. Patel does not see Schiff as a neutral overseer, and he sees him as one of the people who helped legitimize the system Patel believes was weaponized against Trump. Schiff does not see Patel as a normal reformer. He sees him as a man whose entire rise depends on the belief that federal law enforcement should be remade in the image of grievance against its own former guardians. That is why their confrontation cannot be understood as a routine check and balance exercise. The emotional background is far too charged. Schiff's role in public life has long depended on the idea that some institutions, however flawed, still need defenders willing to sound alarm when their independence is threatened. During the Trump years, he often spoke in precisely that register. To his supporters, he sounded like one of the few people trying to keep the country from forgetting what abuse of office can look like when left unanswered. To his detractors, he sounded sanctimonious, overexposed, and too willing to treat every Trump-era scandal as evidence of a system-wide collapse in order to justify ever more investigation and ever more suspicion. Patel's role works in mirror image. To his supporters, he sounds like the man willing to say what establishment Republicans and Democrats alike refused to say for too long, that the federal investigative class was not a neutral guardian, but a political actor. To his critics, he sounds like the perfect vessel for turning anti-bureaucratic rage into actual command over one of the most sensitive institutions in American government. That is why the hearing room tension between them was so combustible. Neither was merely asking or answering. Each was trying to collapse the other into a larger story. Schiff wants Patel to stand for politicization, retaliation, and unfitness. Patel wants Schiff to stand for hypocrisy, fraud, and the old order's refusal to confess its own abuses. That is the whole confrontation in miniature. But there is another reason it matters. It is about who gets to narrate the FBI's crisis of legitimacy. Many Americans no longer trust the Bureau in the old automatic way. Some think it became too politicized against Trump. Others think it is becoming too politicized for Trump. Those are not the same fear, but they coexist. And that coexistence is what makes the Patel-Schiff pair so valuable as a political map. When Schiff questions Patel, he is implicitly telling the public that the Bureau's legitimacy will not be recovered by handing it to someone who treats law enforcement as a battleground for old scores. When Patel attacks Schiff, he is implicitly telling the public that legitimacy cannot be restored by people who still defend the old narratives about Russia, January 6th, and institutional integrity without recognizing how discredited those narratives became for millions of Americans. That is why neither man can really persuade the other. They are not speaking first to each other. They are speaking through each other to a public already divided over whether the FBI's sickness came from too much independence or too much submission. This is also why the particular content of Schiff's questions mattered. His office later emphasized that he pressed Patel over whether FBI employees were being fired for politically tainted reasons, especially people whose work had touched January 6th or Trump-related cases. That issue gets right to the heart of the larger fear. Will an FBI under Patel preserve professional neutrality, or will it become a place where the wrong case assignment in the wrong political era becomes grounds for punishment? Schiff understands that if he can make that fear vivid enough, then Patel stops looking like a reformer and starts looking like an enforcer. Patel, on the other hand, understands that if he can make Schiff sound like the very face of the old overreach, then Schiff's warnings begin to look less like oversight and more like self-protection. That is the essential strategic duel. And it is why the confrontation deserves 30 to 40 minutes instead of a short summary. The deeper issue is not just whether Patel lost his temper or whether Schiff overplayed his hand. The deeper issue is that the two men personify one of the hardest questions in democratic recovery. When an institution loses trust, who gets to repair it? The people who defended the institution before, or the people who spent years attacking it as corrupted? Schiff says repair requires people who still believe in the Bureau as something more than a tool of faction. Patel's rise says millions of Americans no longer trust that kind of steward to define repair. That is not a superficial divide. It is a crisis of custodianship. It also helps explain why the enemy language matters so much. A Reuters retribution tracker showed that Patel's old public posture toward perceived deep state enemies was not forgotten when he came into power. Even if he disowned the phrase enemies list during confirmation, the record stayed alive. That record matters because institutions inherit the moral atmosphere of the people who lead them. If the public believes the director once thought in terms of targets and retribution, then every personnel decision, every investigation, every budget fight, every hearing answer gets read through that atmosphere. Schiff's job is to keep that atmosphere visible. Patel's job is to make the old list look like overblown interpretation, while the new Bureau looks like corrective governance. That is a very hard act, and maybe that is what makes Patel such a dangerous figure for Schiff's side. When he is not merely angry, he is not merely performative. He is capable of sounding like grievance has become policy literacy. He takes anti-establishment suspicion and gives it institutional ambition. That is much more threatening than random populist rage. It suggests a future in which the state is not only criticized by the movement, but partially occupied by it. Schiff, by contrast, sounds threatening to Patel's side because he is not merely another Democrat. He is one of the old guardians of the investigative story, the man who seemed to embody years of public confidence that the system could still name Trump world danger accurately and respond through formal process. If Patel can break Schiff's standing, if he can reduce him to one more discredited scold, then he symbolically breaks a whole chapter of anti-Trump institutional legitimacy with him. That is why their exchanges always feel larger than the room they happen in. They are not debating only the Bureau's current management. They are debating who gets the moral right to describe what happened to the Bureau in the first place. Was it weaponized against Trump, or is it being weaponized now in his favor? Everything else follows from that. This is why the pair fits your channel style perfectly. It has the feeling of hearing room drama, but it is really a long war over what law enforcement means after trust collapse. It has personalities, yes, but also structure. Enemies lists, retribution fears, January 6th, firing concerns, the congressional oversight, and the deeper democratic question of whether institutions can survive if half the country believes their old defenders are dishonest and the other half believes their new reformers are vindictive. That is the American wound underneath the Schiff Patel story, and it does not heal easily. Because even when one side lands a strong point, the other side hears only confirmation of its prior fear. Patel snarls at Schiff, and supporters cheer that someone is finally humiliating one of the old frauds. Critics hear a director revealing exactly the retaliatory temperament they feared. Schiff presses Patel on politicization, and supporters hear courage. Critics hear the old investigative class trying to shield itself from democratic correction. That symmetry is why the fight endures. It is not a debate with common standards. It is a collision between rival standards of institutional recovery. And until the country decides whether the Bureau is being reclaimed or repurposed, the Patel-Schiff confrontation will keep feeling unfinished. That is the real meaning of the pair. Not just two men arguing in Washington, but two stories of the state fighting over which one gets to call itself reform. Schiff says reform means saving the Bureau from political vengeance. Patel says reform means wrenching the Bureau away from the people who spent years pretending it was cleaner than it was. The public watches. And because the public has not decided which fear should govern the future of the FBI, the confrontation remains alive. That is why it still matters. And that is why this story belongs in long form. And there is another reason the Patel-Schiff confrontation deserves to be longer than a standard hearing recap. It is one of the clearest recent examples of how two sides can both claim to be trying to save the same institution while meaning almost opposite things by save. That is what makes the pair so politically potent. Kash Patel does not present himself as someone who wants to destroy the FBI. He presents himself as someone who wants to rescue it from a captured, politicized, internally corrupted version of itself. Adam Schiff does not present himself as someone who wants the Bureau frozen in amber, untouched by reform. He presents himself as someone trying to stop the Bureau from being hollowed out and repurposed by a movement that defines reform as revenge against old custodians. Both men therefore speak the language of rescue, when that is what makes the confrontation so dangerous. The country is not choosing between one man who says save the FBI and another who says burn it down. It is choosing between rival rescue stories. Patel's rescue story is fueled by grievance memory, the Russia years, the January 6th investigative years, the broader Trump world sense of being pursued by a self-protective state apparatus. These experiences form the emotional engine of his case. He speaks as though the Bureau became unrecognizable because it stopped serving the people and started serving a political class. Schiff's rescue story is fueled by institutional fragility. He speaks as though the Bureau may be flawed, but it cannot survive being run by someone who sees its recent history chiefly through the lens of anti-Trump victimhood and enemy identification. Watch that difference is everything. It also helps explain why their direct exchanges feel so personal. Each side hears in the other not just a different policy preference, but a falsification of history. Schiff believes Patel's politics reframe the Bureau's hardest investigative obligations as deep state abuse. Patel believes Schiff's politics reframe real abuse as noble institutional vigilance. That means every hearing question is shadowed by a larger history argument. What really happened to the FBI over the last decade? Was it too independent from Trump or too ready to serve anti-Trump narratives? Was it a target of political paranoia or a source of political distortion? Patel and Schiff are among the most legible representatives of those competing answers. This is why the Reuters retribution tracker matters so much. It showed that Patel's public posture before taking office was not simply technocratic reform language. It had the texture of target identification, of naming a world of enemies inside the executive branch and around it. Even if Patel later softened or denied the enemies list framing, the older posture remained part of his public identity. That is what makes Schiff's warnings feel more than partisan. He can point to a documented rhetorical history and say, "This is not projection. The man told you how he thinks." The danger in Schiff's telling is not hypothetical. It was pre-advertised. But Patel's side has an answer to that too. The enemy vocabulary, they would argue, only sounds extreme if you still believe the old institutional story about neutrality. If you believe the Bureau and its surrounding ecosystem really were bent against Trump, then naming the people involved does not sound like paranoia. It sounds like overdue honesty. That is the entire appeal of Patel-style politics. It does not reject institutions on anarchic grounds. It rejects the legitimacy of the people who ran them. That makes it more coherent and therefore more formidable than simple anti-government rage. This is why Schiff cannot defeat Patel merely by sounding offended. He has to make the public feel the transition from rhetoric to power. He has to show what happens when anti-institutional grievance acquires a badge, a title, a personnel budget, and command authority. That is what oversight hearings allow him to do. He can take the abstract fear, politicized retribution, and ask questions that turn it into visible implication. Who was fired? Why? On what basis? Were prior commitments kept? Are January 6 assignments now liabilities? Are enemies being formalized into administrative categories? These questions matter because they make the Bureau's future feel less like argument and more like institutional weather already changing around people. Patel, meanwhile, must do the reverse. He must take actions that critics see as evidence of politicization and reframe them as merit, correction, or public honesty. He must say the Bureau is finally getting cleaned up rather than selectively purged. He must say morale is fine, reform is necessary, and Democrats like Schiff are not guardians, but compromised referees angry that someone else now controls the whistle. That is why his insults matter politically. Calling Schiff a fraud or a buffoon is not just losing his temper. It is a way of lowering the standing of the questioner so the public sees the hearing less as accountability and more as one discredited class's resentment at being displaced. That strategy works because standing is central here. The pair is not simply arguing facts, they are fighting over who gets to interpret the institution with credibility. Schiff's entire posture depends on the idea that his warnings still have moral weight despite years of polarization. Patel's posture depends on the idea that people like Schiff exhausted that weight long ago and are now borrowing authority from a version of the FBI that no longer deserves it. That is why the clash keeps escalating. If either grants the other standing, he loses too much of his own case. This also makes the confrontation a very modern one. It is not about whether institutions should exist. It is about which social class gets to narrate them. The old class of investigators, intelligence-linked voices, national security liberals, and constitutional overseers still claims the right to name danger. The insurgent class aligned with Trump says that naming function itself was corrupted and now must be seized, not merely corrected. Patel is an insurgent administrator. Schiff is an establishment critic of the insurgent administrator. Put them together and you get one of the cleanest illustrations possible of late-stage institutional war. And because the FBI is not just any institution, the stakes feel uniquely high. Americans tolerate a lot of disorder elsewhere, but they want, at minimum, sought to believe that the country's premier federal investigative bureau is not simply a factional weapon. Once that belief thins out, everything gets harder. High-profile investigations look suspect. Personnel decisions look political. Oversight looks retaliatory. Reform looks like capture. Patel and Schiff are battling precisely over which of those perceptions becomes dominant. That is why the pair belongs in your long-form style. It is not just personal drama. It is a referendum on institutional memory. Patel says the memory of the Bureau's conduct has been falsified by people like Schiff. Schiff says the future of the Bureau is being endangered by people like Patel precisely because they are using grievance about the past to justify a politically dangerous reconstruction of the institution. Hey, the hearing room is just where those rival memories briefly become audible at the same time. And the country still has not chosen between them cleanly. That is why the confrontation lasts. Not because one side has a perfect case, but because the institution itself has already lost enough trust that both rescue stories can sound plausible to different publics. That is the nightmare and the fascination of Kash Patel versus Adam Schiff. It is a fight over who gets to save the FBI by claiming to know what broke it. And until the public regains some shared answer to that question, neither side's story is going away. There is one final reason the Patel-Schiff confrontation deserves even more room. It shows how hard it is for institutions to survive once they are forced to answer two opposite accusations at the same time. Honestly, if the FBI resists political pressure from Trump world, one side says that proves the old deep state culture is still alive. If the FBI bends too visibly toward Trump world priorities, the other side says that proves the Bureau has become a partisan weapon. That means the institution no longer occupies a stable center. It lives inside a crossfire where almost every action confirms someone's worst fear. Patel and Schiff personify those fears with unusual clarity. Patel carries the grievance that the old center was fake. Schiff carries the fear that abandoning the old center means there is no center left at all. That is why their exchanges feel so much larger than the room. They are not really arguing over one firing, one list, or one hearing answer. They are arguing over whether a central federal institution can still claim to be more than the political memory wars being projected onto it. Schiff is trying to preserve that possibility. Patel is trying to reconstruct it through a purge of the assumptions that once defined it. Each side believes the other's cure is the disease. And because the public now hears institutions through personality and faction more than through inherited reverence, the fight becomes almost impossible to settle by process alone. Hearings do not close it. Statements do not close it. Even performance reviews and budget debates do not close it. The underlying question survives. Who broke the FBI first, and who now gets to say what repair looks like? That is why the pair still matters, because the country has not answered that question. And until it does, Kash Patel and Adam Schiff will keep sounding like they are debating an institution, when in fact they are debating the entire political era that institution has been forced to survive.